The briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command fell silent when she walked in. Not the respectful kind of silence that greets a decorated operator, but the suffocating quiet that comes before laughter barely held behind teeth. Lieutenant Kiera Vance moved through it like water, her boots clicking against linoleum with a rhythm that suggested she'd walked through worse. The men seated around the table didn't bother hiding their smirks. A woman in a SEAL team wasn't just unusual, it was a disruption to an order they considered sacred. And the fact that she'd earned her trident through the same crucible that had broken most of them only seemed to make it worse. The briefing officer, a barrel-chested commander named Rourke, slid a folder across the table without looking at her. "Joint training exercise," he said flatly. "9 Marine recon operators, force on force. You'll be the opposition." Someone coughed to cover a laugh. Vance didn't react. She opened the folder and scanned the details with eyes that had learned to read terrain, weather, and human failure with equal precision. The exercise would take place in the mountains of Camp Pendleton, a brutal stretch of chaparral and granite that had humbled more than one cocky operator. She'd be alone. No support. No backup. Just her kit, her training, and the weight of a community that wanted her to fail. What none of them knew, what the folder didn't mention, was that Kiera Vance had earned her call sign not in Bud S., but years earlier in a place so classified that even the Marines in the room with their chest-thumping bravado wouldn't have clearance to know its name. They called her Wraith, because in another life in another war, she'd learned how to move through hostile ground like smoke, how to read the intentions of men trained to kill, and how to end threats before they knew she existed. The Marines didn't know that. Rourke didn't know that. They saw what they wanted to see, a woman in their world, an outsider to be tested and found wanting. She closed the folder and met Rourke's eyes for the first time. Rules of engagement, her voice was calm, almost bored. Standard force on force, simunition rounds, first team to neutralize the other wins. Rourke leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. The Marines requested this specifically. They want to prove a point. Vance nodded once, then stood. As she turned to leave, one of the SEALs at the table, a petty officer named Garrett with more ego than sense, muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Try not to cry, warrior." The mountains swallowed her before dawn. Kiera moved through the darkness with the kind of patience that can't be taught, only earned through repetition and survival. Her kit was stripped down to essentials. Chest rig with 6 magazines, hydration pack, helmet-mounted nods, and the modified M4 that felt like an extension of her body. The simunition rounds were marked with blue tips, but the weight of movement, the stakes of reputation, those were real as bullets. She'd studied the terrain for 2 hours the night before, memorizing ridgelines and draws, water sources and natural choke points. The Marines would come in heavy, confident, probably in a standard 2-team split with overlapping fields of fire. They'd expect her to hunker down, to defend, to react. That was the first mistake. Wraith didn't defend. She hunted. The sun broke over the eastern ridge an hour after she'd positioned herself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the main approach trail. Through her optics she watched them move in, exactly as predicted. 4-man team on point, 5-man team trailing by 50 meters. Good spacing, professional movement, but loud in the way that men who have never had to hide from real predators are always loud. She let them pass beneath her position, controlled her breathing, felt the cool morning air on her face. The lead team was already 100 meters past when she moved. Not toward them but parallel, using a dried creek that ran along the western slope. Speed and stealth weren't opposites if you knew how to balance them. Her boots found purchase on stone, avoided the loose scree that would rattle and betray. Every movement was deliberate, economic, informed by years of moving through places where mistakes meant body bags. The radio chatter was predictable. Alpha Team, 200 meters from Checkpoint 1. No contact. Bravo Team, copy. We're 50 meters behind you. Terrain's rough but manageable. She smiled without humor. They were treating this like a training stroll, like the enemy was something theoretical that would announce itself with flags and fanfare. She keyed her own radio once, a single click that would register on their frequency as interference. Then she moved faster. The first Marine never saw her coming. He was pulling rear security for Alpha Team, weapon at low ready, eyes scanning but not truly seeing. Vance materialized from behind a cluster of manzanita, her approach covered by the sound of wind through the brush. The simunition round caught him center mass, the blue splash of paint spreading across his plate carrier like accusation. He spun, training overriding shock, but she was already gone, fatting back into the terrain before he could call it in. Confusion spread through their net like poison. Contact rear. Bravo team, we have contact. The voice was sharp, the professionalism cracking just slightly. They consolidated fast, she had to give them credit for that. Both teams pulled into a hasty defensive perimeter, weapons outward, scanning the ridgelines and draws. But they were looking for an enemy that would press, that would follow up, that would behave like every opponent they'd trained against. Wraith didn't press. She vanished. For 20 minutes she let them stew in their perimeter, let the adrenaline fade into fatigue, let the questions start to creep in. Where was she? How had she gotten so close? Was this just luck, or were they dealing with something different? She used the time to circle wide, moving through terrain so rough that their instructors had probably told them no one would be crazy enough to traverse it under pressure. Steep granite faces, loose talus, thorny chaparral that tore at her uniform and drew blood she ignored. Pain was just information, and right now the information said she was winning. The second Marine fell while taking a knee to adjust his radio. Vance had worked her way to a position above and behind their perimeter, using the sun at her back to obscure any silhouette. The shot was textbook. Controlled breathing, gentle trigger press, target never knew he was compromised. The blue paint bloomed on his shoulder and neck. This time the reaction was faster but more chaotic. Contact high, northwest ridge. Round snapped overhead, simunition markers streaking through the air like angry wasps, but they were shooting at ghosts at positions she'd already abandoned. By the time they adjusted fire, she was 40 meters east, watching through her optic as they wasted ammunition on empty space. She could hear the frustration in their voices now, the first hints of doubt. Where the fuck is she? Bravo lead, do you have eyes on? Negative, negative, she's moving too fast. That was the thing they didn't understand, the thing that made Wraith different. Speed wasn't about how fast you ran. It was about how fast you decided, how fast you read terrain and enemy intention, how fast you moved inside their decision cycle and lived there, making them react while you acted. She keyed her radio again, but this time she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. 7 left. The third and fourth Marines went down in rapid succession as Vance exploited their confusion. They'd clustered tighter after the second hit, an instinctive response that made them easier to predict. She'd worked around to their southern flank, using a shallow ravine that offered concealment and a perfect angle on their perimeter. The third Marine was scanning north when the blue round caught him in the side. The fourth turned toward the shot and took one in the chest before he could acquire a target. The radio erupted. Contact south. Got him it, she's everywhere. Bravo team, collapse on Alpha's position. But collapsing meant moving, and movement meant exposure. She'd learned this in places where the enemy didn't use simunition, where the paint was red and permanent. These Marines were good, they were professionals, but they were fighting their training instead of thinking past it. They expected linear warfare, positions held, flanks secured, fire superiority established. Wraith fought like water, like wind, like something that couldn't be fixed in place or predicted by doctrine. She let them consolidate again, let them think they'd found safety in numbers. The remaining 5 Marines formed a tight circle, weapons out, every angle covered. It was a good defensive position, textbook even. It was also a trap of their own making. From her position 70 meters upslope, hidden in the deep shadow of an overhanging boulder, she could see all of them. More importantly, she could see the patterns in how they moved, who was disciplined and who kept shifting weight from foot to foot, who maintained scan discipline and who kept glancing at his teammates for reassurance. The one glancing, a young sergeant with his rank barely worn in, would be next. She waited for the moment when his scan pattern brought him facing away from her, when the man to his left was checking his magazine, when the gap in their collective awareness opened like a door. The shot took the sergeant high in the back plate. He lurched forward with a curse, and the perimeter dissolved into chaos. They spun inward and outward simultaneously, trying to cover every direction at once and therefore covering nothing effectively. She was already moving, using the confusion to close distance, sprinting across open ground that should have been suicide but became possibility because they were looking everywhere except the most obvious approach. The fifth Marine saw her at the last second, started to bring his weapon up. She shot him twice, center mass, then used his falling body as cover while she acquired the sixth target. Blue paint. Blue paint. The mathematics of combat reduced to simple subtraction. 3 Marines remained, and the dynamic had shifted completely. They weren't hunters anymore, weren't the confident operators who'd walked into these mountains expecting an easy validation of their superiority. They were survivors, backs against metaphorical walls, trying to solve a problem that kept changing shape. Vance gave them 5 minutes to think about it. She displaced immediately after the last engagement, working back up into higher ground where she could observe without being observed. Through her optics, she watched them argue in angry, clipped sentences. One wanted to break contact, to withdraw and request extraction. Another insisted they push forward, that running would be worse than losing. The third, a staff sergeant whose body language suggested he was in command, kept checking his map like it might offer answers the terrain wouldn't. She knew what they were thinking because she'd been there herself, years ago, in situations where the enemy was invisible and the ground itself seemed hostile. The difference was that she'd had real bullets to focus the mind, real consequences that taught lessons theoretical combat never could. These Marines were learning those lessons now in paint and pride. When they finally moved, they moved smart. Bounding Overwatch, proper spacing, using terrain for cover instead of just crossing it. If this had been any other opponent, they might have made it work. But Wraith had already decided where they'd go, had already positioned herself not where they were, but where they'd have to be. The draw they were moving through narrowed ahead, channeled by steep walls of granite on both sides. It was the only logical route if they wanted to maintain speed and tactical cohesion. It was also a fatal funnel, and she owned the high ground above it. She let the point man pass completely through. Let the second man, the staff sergeant, get into the narrowest section. Then she took the third, the one still in the open with no cover forward or back. Blue paint on his helmet. The shot echoed off stone walls, sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere. The staff sergeant made the right call immediately. Break contact, fall back. But falling back meant crossing the same open ground, and she'd already shifted position, already had the angle. The point man went down as he tried to run. Blew across his legs and lower back. That left the staff sergeant alone, trapped in the narrow draw with nowhere to go but forward or back. Both options covered, both options fatal. She keyed her radio. One left. You can drop your weapon or you can take the shot. Either way, it's over. The staff sergeant's voice came back after a long moment, tight with frustration but professional. Who the fuck are you? Vance didn't answer immediately. She watched him through her optics, saw him scanning the ridgeline, trying to spot her even though he knew it was futile. He was a good Marine, she could tell. Good enough to know when he was beaten. Good enough to be angry about it. Call sign Wraith, she finally replied. Navy SEAL, and you just got walked through the valley by someone you thought didn't belong. Silence on the radio. Then slowly, the staff sergeant lowered his weapon and raised his hands. The blue paint marker hit him square in the chest 5 seconds later anyway, because this wasn't about mercy, it was about completing the mission. When she walked into his position, boots crunching on loose stone, he was sitting against a boulder with his helmet off, breathing hard. Up close he looked younger than his rank suggested, maybe 26, with the kind of face that had seen deployment but not yet lost the edges. 9 of us, he said, not quite a question. How? She pulled her own helmet off, let him see her face clearly for the first time. Short dark hair plastered with sweat, eyes that didn't apologize for what they'd done, a jawline set with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. You fought like you expected me to fight like you. That was the mistake. He processed that, then nodded slowly. There was no shame in his expression, just the raw honesty of a professional acknowledging superior craft. The other guys, the ones back at command, they're going to lose their minds. Good. She keyed her radio to the main frequency, the one she knew Rourke and the others would be monitoring. "Command, this is Wraith. Exercise complete. All 9 opposition forces neutralized. Requesting extraction at primary LZ." The silence that followed was absolute. She could picture them in the briefing room, staring at radios, trying to process what they'd just heard, trying to reconcile their expectations with the impossible reality that had just been transmitted over open channels. Finally, Rourke's voice came back, stripped of its earlier dismissiveness. "Copy that, Wraith. Extraction inbound. Time," she checked her watch, "94 minutes from initial contact." Another pause. "94 minutes for 9 Marines." Affirmative. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain, didn't justify. The numbers spoke for themselves. The helicopter settled into the landing zone with rotor wash that bent the chaparral flat and threw dust into the air like brown fog. Vance loaded the defeated Marines first, made sure each one was accounted for, and secured before she climbed aboard herself. They didn't speak during the flight back, but their silence had changed. No more smirks, no more barely concealed contempt. Just the 1,000-yard stares of men whose certainties had been dismantled in less than 2 hours. When they touched down at Naval Special Warfare Command, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the base with the speed that gossip and impossible stories always travel. SEALs and support staff lined the tarmac, watching as Vance stepped off the helo with her kit still rigged, her uniform torn and bloodied from the chaparral, her face composed in that neutral expression that gave nothing away. Commander Rourke was waiting at the edge of the crowd, arms still crossed but posture different. She walked straight to him, stopped at proper distance, waited. 9 Marines, he said finally. 9 recon operators in 94 minutes. Yes, sir. How? It was the same question the staff sergeant had asked, but coming from Rourke it carried different weight. This wasn't curiosity, it was professional assessment, a need to understand what variables had produced this outcome. She considered how much to say, how much to reveal about the classified operations that had forged her into something more than the standard SEAL template. In the end, she kept it simple. "I didn't fight their fight, sir, I fought mine." Rourke studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Dismissed, Lieutenant. Get cleaned up. Debrief is at 1600. She saluted, crisp and precise, then walked through the crowd. The SEALs parted for her now, and if their faces still held skepticism, it was muted, overlaid with something that might eventually become respect. Petty Officer Garrett, the one who'd made the crying comment, stood near the back. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "Something you want to say?" Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, the same tone she'd used on the radio. Garrett swallowed hard, then shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Good." She moved past him, headed for the barracks, leaving him and the others to process what had just happened. The debrief was supposed to be clinical, a professional analysis of tactics and techniques. But the room felt charged when Vance walked in, her uniform now clean but her presence still carrying the weight of the morning's demonstration. The 9 Marines were there, sitting along one wall like students awaiting judgment. The SEALs occupied the other side, their usual confidence tempered by questions they didn't want to ask out loud. Rourke stood at the head of the table with a laptop open, satellite imagery of the training area displayed on the wall screen. He waited until Vance took her seat, then began without preamble. "We're going to walk through this engagement step by step, not to assign blame but to understand methodology." He clicked through images showing the terrain, the initial positions, the routes of movement. "Lieutenant Vance, start with your initial strategy." She stood, moved to the screen, began tracing lines and positions with a kind of calm precision that suggested she'd done this before in far more consequential settings. The Marines approached with standard small unit tactics, 2 teams inbounding Overwatch. Good by doctrine, predictable in execution. I let them commit to the terrain before engaging, then hit the rear security with a single shot to create confusion. The staff sergeant, whose name she'd learned was Kowalski, raised his hand. "Why rear security first? Why not take the point man?" "Because the point man's death makes you cautious. Rear security's death makes you paranoid. You don't know if the threat is behind you or ahead, so you have to defend everything." She moved to the next image. After first contact, I displaced immediately, used terrain you'd written off as untraversable to reposition. While you consolidated, I circled wide and took the high ground. One of the SEALs, a lieutenant commander named Pierce, leaned forward. The terrain analysis says that route should have taken 40 minutes minimum. You did it in 20. I accepted risk, Vance replied simply. Speed was more valuable than safety. In a real fight, those Marines would have been calling for QRF or air support. I had to end it before that happened. She continued through each engagement, explaining not just what she'd done but why, the decision trees that had led to each shot, each displacement, each moment of patience or aggression. The room stayed silent, absorbing lessons that were being taught without judgment or condescension. When she finished, Rourke stood and faced the room. What Lieutenant Vance demonstrated today is the difference between following doctrine and understanding warfare. The Marines executed their training perfectly, and that was their vulnerability. He let that sink in, then continued. Every operator in this room needs to ask themselves, am I training to pass evaluations, or am I training to win fights against thinking enemies who won't follow my assumptions? Kowalski stood, his jaw tight but his eyes clear. Sir, request permission to speak. Granted. When we requested this exercise, we thought we were proving something about standards, about whether certain people belonged in our community. He looked directly at Vance. We were wrong, not about standards, but about who we were measuring. Ma'am, I apologize. You're a better operator than any of us proved to be today. The words hung in the air, honest and raw in a way that military culture rarely allowed. Vance met his eyes, saw the sincerity there, then nodded once. You're good Marine, Staff Sergeant. You just fought the wrong fight. Learn from it. Another Marine stood, then another, until all 9 were on their feet in something that wasn't quite attention but carried the weight of respect earned through competence rather than courtesy. Rourke watched this unfold with an expression that suggested he was recalculating assumptions he'd held for years. Lieutenant Vance, he said quietly, I owe you an apology as well. When you joined this command, I saw a problem to be managed. I should have seen an asset to be utilized. She turned to face him, and for the first time since entering the room, something like emotion crossed her face. Not pride or satisfaction, but perhaps the exhaustion of someone who'd been proving herself for so long that recognition felt more like relief than victory. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because 9 Marines and a room full of SEALs needed to learn that your assumptions about who belongs in this community are based on tradition, not capability. The enemy doesn't care about our traditions. They care about who can kill them first. The silence that followed was profound. Then Rourke did something no one expected. He smiled. A real smile, tired and honest. Point taken, Lieutenant. Dismissed. The story should have ended there, with respect earned and lessons learned. But stories in the military never end cleanly because the institution has a memory, and that memory runs deeper than individual moments of recognition. Over the following weeks, Vance's demonstration rippled through naval special warfare like a stone thrown into still water. The Marines, to their credit, didn't hide what had happened. Kowalski wrote a detailed after-action report that focused on tactics rather than embarrassment, and that report made its way through Marine recon channels, then to other special operations units, then eventually to training commands who studied it for lessons about complacency and assumption. But the SEAL community's response was more complicated. Some operators, the ones secure enough in their own competence to recognize excellence regardless of its packaging, treated Vance differently after that day. They sought her input on training scenarios, asked her to evaluate their tactics, included her in the informal networks where real knowledge gets shared. Others doubled down on their skepticism, insisting that the exercise had been a fluke, that 9 against 1 was somehow unfair to the 9, that real combat would produce different results. Pierce, the lieutenant commander who'd questioned her timeline during the debrief, belonged to the first category. He found Vance in the team room 3 weeks after the exercise, nursing coffee that had gone cold while she reviewed intelligence reports on a target package in Syria. Got a minute? He asked. She looked up, evaluated his body language, then nodded toward the empty chair across from her. He sat, was quiet for a moment, then said, I'm running a training package next month. Close quarters battle in urban terrain. Mix of SEALs and agency contractors. I want you to run opposition force." It wasn't a request, wasn't a test. It was an admission that she brought value that the community needed. "How many?" 12, all experienced operators, she smiled slightly. "You want me to embarrass them or teach them? Both if you can manage it." "I'll think about it." Pierce stood, then paused. "The thing about that exercise with the Marines, the thing people don't want to say out loud is that you weren't just better than them. You were better than most of us would have been in the same situation." That afternoon, Vance found herself in the one place on base where rank and reputation dissolved into simple human interaction, the base gym. She was halfway through a brutal conditioning circuit when Garrett, the petty officer who'd made the crying comment, appeared on the rowing machine next to her. They worked in silence for 10 minutes, the only sounds their breathing and the mechanical rhythm of equipment under load. Finally, Garrett spoke without looking at her. "I was an asshole." She didn't break stride on the assault bike. "Yes, you were. I don't have a good excuse. I was worried about standards, about the teams changing, about whether we could maintain what makes us effective if we started making exceptions." "I'm not an exception," she said quietly. "I'm the standard, that's what you don't understand yet." He processed that, kept rowing, then said, "Teach me." She slowed the bike, looked at him directly. "Teach you what?" "How to think like you do. How to see what you saw in those mountains. I've been doing this job for 6 years, and you made me look like a boot fresh out of training. I need to know what I'm missing." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived at the command, more valuable than Kowalski's apology or Pierce's invitation, because it acknowledged not just her competence but her ability to transfer knowledge. "You're missing the fact that warfare isn't about domination," she said, returning to the bike at a slower pace. "It's about understanding. You can't impose your will on an enemy who won't accept your framework. You have to think like them, move like them, and then be one decision faster. That's not how we train." "I know, that's why you needed me to show you." Garrett nodded slowly, still rowing, thinking. After another minute he said, the crying comment, "That was fucked up, I'm sorry." "Apology accepted. Now finish your circuit and we'll talk tactics." They trained together for 2 hours, and by the end, Garrett understood more about warfare than 6 years of traditional training had taught him. Not because Vance had superior physical capabilities, but because she understood that combat was ultimately about outthinking people who were trying to kill you. The invitation came on a Wednesday, delivered by a commander from the Intelligence Support Activity, who arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command without announcement and asked for Vance by name. They met in a secure conference room, just the two of them, with no recording devices and no official documentation of the conversation. The commander was a slight man in his 50s, with the kind of quiet competence that suggested most of his career had happened in places that didn't officially exist. "Lieutenant Vance, I'm Commander Hadley. I work for an organization you've probably never heard of, running operations you definitely don't have clearance to know about." She waited, said nothing, let him continue. "We've been watching your career with interest. Bud S. graduate, top of your class, combat deployment to Afghanistan where you earned a Bronze Star for actions that remain classified. Then this thing with the Marines, which was frankly the most impressive piece of individual combat operations I've seen in 20 years. He slid a thin folder across the table. "We have a problem that requires your specific skill set. I can't tell you details unless you agree to at least hear the pitch, and I can't give you the pitch unless you sign an NDA that makes your current clearances look like public information." Vance opened the folder, scanned the single page inside. A non-disclosure agreement so dense with classification warnings and legal consequences that reading it felt like staring into an abyss. She looked up at Hadley. "Why me specifically?" "Because the operation requires someone who can move through hostile territory alone, engage and neutralize multiple targets without support, and do it all without leaving evidence that we were ever there. Your performance in the training exercise suggests you can do that. Your record in Afghanistan confirms it." She thought about the question for exactly 10 seconds, then signed the NDA. Hadley pulled the folder back, replaced it with another, thicker one. "6 months ago, A CIA asset in Syria was compromised. Before they could extract him, he was taken by a group we can't officially acknowledge exists. We know where he's being held, a compound in the Hamid region guarded by at least 15 hostiles, all experienced fighters. Official rescue is politically impossible. Unofficial rescue is what we do. You want me to go in alone? Vance asked. We want you to lead a 4-person team. But yes, the operational reality is that you'll be functioning independently once you're on target. Hadley opened the second folder, revealing satellite imagery of a compound that looked like a dozen others scattered across the Syrian desert. Concrete walls, guard towers, a central building surrounded by smaller structures. But the details told a different story. Overlapping fields of fire, no obvious approach routes, defensive positions that suggested the people holding this place understood how assaults worked. The asset's name is Michael Corvin, Hadley continued. Former Delta operator who transitioned to intelligence work. He's been in that compound for 16 days. We believe he's still alive, but our window for extraction is closing rapidly. Intel suggests they're planning to move him within 72 hours. Vance studied the imagery, her mind already running calculations about angles of approach, timing, vulnerabilities. What's the team composition? 2 other SEALs, both with combat experience. 1 Army Intelligence Support Activity Operator who speaks Arabic and knows the region. And you, as team leader. Why not a more experienced SEAL for team leader? It was a legitimate question, and Hadley's answer was immediate. Because the experienced SEALs we have available think in terms of overwhelming force and fire superiority. This operation requires someone who thinks like you demonstrated in those mountains: patience, precision, and the ability to exploit enemy assumptions. He pulled out another image, this one a close-up of the compound's interior courtyard. Corvin is being held in the northwest building, 2nd floor. Guard rotation every 4 hours, usually 3 to 4 guards inside with him at all times. External security varies between 8 and 12 hostiles depending on time of day. The compound is supplied by vehicle convoys twice weekly, which gives us potential windows for infiltration. Vance traced the compound's perimeter with her finger, noting distances and dead spaces. What's the support package? Helicopter insertion 15 kilometers out. You walk in, conduct the operation, walk back out. Extraction will be waiting at the same LZ. No drone coverage, no close air support, no QRF. If things go wrong, you're on your own. She looked up from the imagery. When? You have 48 hours to train with the team. Wheels up in 72. The team assembled in a windowless briefing room that smelled like stale coffee and the particular anxiety that comes before high-risk operations. Vance walked in and immediately assessed the 3 men who would be placing their lives in her hands and expecting her to keep them alive. The first SEAL was a senior chief named Marcus Trent, late 30s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent more time in combat zones than safe ones. He nodded when she entered, a gesture that conveyed professional respect without warmth. The second SEAL was younger, a first-class petty officer named Jason Wu, built like a gymnast with the quick eyes of someone who processed tactical information at speed. The ISA operator was a warrant officer named David Khalil, ethnically ambiguous in the way that made him valuable for operations in the Middle East, with the quiet confidence of someone who talked his way out of situations that should have ended badly. Vance set her tablet on the table, pulled up the compound imagery, then spoke without preamble. I'm Lieutenant Kiera Vance. Call sign Wraith. I'll be running this operation. Before we start, I need to know if anyone has a problem taking orders from me. Trent raised his hand slightly. Not a problem, just a question. I've got 15 years as a SEAL, 6 combat deployments. Why am I not running this? It was a fair question, asked without hostility. She appreciated that. Because I've spent the last 3 years running singleton operations in denied territory. I know how to move through hostile ground without triggering responses. That's what this mission requires. Singleton operations where? Wu asked. Classified above your clearance. What I can tell you is that I've done this specific type of infiltration, interdiction, and extraction before, successfully, Multiple times. Kalo leaned forward, his Arabic accent subtle but present. The compound we're hitting, the hostiles there, they're not amateurs. They're former Iraqi special forces who have been fighting coalition forces for 20 years. They know how Americans operate. Good, Vance replied. Then they'll be expecting Americans who operate in predictable ways. We won't give them that. She pulled up the tactical plan she'd spent the previous 12 hours developing. We insert here, 15 kilometers northwest of the target. 4-hour approach march through terrain that's mostly flat desert with minimal cover. That's our first vulnerability. Trent studied the proposed route, then shook his head. 4-hour movement across open desert at night will be visible on thermals from 5 kilometers out if they're running Overwatch. Which is why we're not moving across open desert, Vance replied. She zoomed in on the map, highlighting a shallow wadi that ran roughly parallel to their approach vector. We follow this drainage. It's not direct, adds 90 minutes to our timeline, but it keeps us below sight lines and provides thermal masking. Wu traced the wadi with his finger. It's going to be slow going, probably cut up from rockfall, maybe flooded if they've had rain. We deal with it. Speed is less important than arriving undetected. She moved to the next phase. Once we're within 2 kilometers of the compound, we split. Khalil and I move to the eastern approach. Trent and Wu take the western side. We observe for 40 minutes, confirm guard rotations and positions, then I signal green light or abort. Khalil raised an eyebrow. 40 minutes of observation before we commit. Most teams would observe for 10, then hit. Most teams have air support and QRF if things go sideways. We don't. We get one chance to do this right. She pulled up the interior compound layout. Based on intel, Corvin is here, second floor of the northwest building. Guard rotation every 4 hours with shifts changing at 0200, 0600, 1000, and 1400. We're hitting during the 0200 rotation, when guards are tired and response times are slower. Trent was nodding now, seeing the logic. How do we get over the walls without alerting external security? We don't go over the walls. We go through the gate. That got their attention. Vance pulled up surveillance footage that ISA had acquired from a local asset, showing the compound's main entrance. The gate opens twice during night hours for guard shift changes, 0130 and 0530. We time our arrival for 0125. When the gate opens for the guard change, we're already in position. In the confusion of people coming and going, we slip inside. Wu frowned. That's a lot of variables depending on timing and luck. It's not luck if you've planned for every contingency, and we will. For the next 8 hours, they rehearsed the mission on a mock-up compound that the training team had constructed based on the intelligence package. Every movement was timed. Every contingency planned, every communication minimized to hand signals and prearranged clicks on the radio. Vance pushed them hard, running the approach march 3 times until they could navigate the simulated wadi in darkness without stumbling, without unnecessary noise, without breaking the tactical formation that kept them invisible to theoretical observers. Trent, despite his initial questions about leadership, proved to be exactly the kind of operator Vance needed. Experienced enough to know when something wouldn't work, but professional enough to suggest alternatives instead of complaints. During the 4th run-through, when their planned entry point proved impossible due to unexpected angles of observation, he pulled her aside. The gate timing is tight. If the guard change is even 3 minutes off our estimate, we're exposed in open ground with nowhere to go. I know, she replied. Alternative. We don't wait for the gate. We create our own distraction on the southern wall, something loud enough to pull attention, then go over the eastern wall while they're responding. She considered it, ran the variables, then shook her head. Distractions mean we lose surprise. The moment they know something's wrong, even if they don't know what, their alert status changes. We need them comfortable, routine, not looking for threats. So we're betting the mission on their punctuality. No. We're betting the mission on human nature. Guard changes are the most predictable thing any military organization does. People want to be relieved on time. People want to go sleep. That makes them punctual in ways that combat operations never are. Trent studied her for a moment, then nodded. You've done this before. Yes. How many times? Enough to know that perfect plans fail, but plans based on understanding human behavior usually work. They ran the rehearsal again, this time with Trent's concerns addressed through adjusted positions that gave them fallback options if timing failed. By the 10th hour, the team was moving like a single organism, each member anticipating the other's movements, communication reduced to the bare minimum. Wu pulled her aside during a break, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Vance nodded, curious what had been bothering the younger SEAL. "That exercise with the Marines, the one that everyone's talking about, did you really take down 9 recon operators alone?" "Yes." "How?" It was the question everyone asked, the one she was getting tired of answering. But Wu deserved a real response, not a deflection. "I understood that they were fighting to win a training exercise. I was fighting to prove I belonged. Those are different motivations and they produce different levels of commitment. That's not a tactical answer. Because it's not a tactical question. Tactics are easy. The hard part is understanding why you're fighting and what you're willing to sacrifice to win. The Marines were willing to sacrifice their time and their pride. I was willing to sacrifice everything." Wu absorbed that, then said quietly, "For this mission, the one we're about to do for real, what are you willing to sacrifice?"